And this is the question of the novel, The Great Gatsby, and of Fitzgerald's life. Who is American? And it's a question equally valid today. Who is American? And in Fitzgerald's eyes, being American at the time was being colonial Anglo-Saxon stock.
That was the voice of Patrick O'Sullivan Greene, author of Gatsby, Death of an Irishman. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. In a crowded field of books on F. Scott Fitzgerald, Patrick O'Sullivan Greene took on the ambitious challenge of exploring the troubled author's fraught relationship with his Irish identity. As we mark the 100th anniversary of The Great Gatsby on April 10th, we're delighted to welcome Patrick to discuss his new book, Gatsby, Death of an Irishman. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Martin. I'm looking forward to this.
So I'm going to start here. Tell me about your first encounter with The Great Gatsby.
My first encounter with The Great Gatsby was when I started researching my second book, Revolution at the Waldorf, about De Valera's visit to America in 1919. And there was a quote from Fitzgerald's first book that Amory Blaine suspected that being Irish was somewhat common. And that kind of triggered a whole different field of thought on how I'd approach that book. Because the traditional view growing up in Ireland is Irish America being proud of being of the Irish heritage, where I came across one of the most famous Irish Americans who had absolute shame in his heritage. And what that led me to look at changed the entire perspective on De Valera in America was I looked at De Valera in America from the perspective of Irish America. So it isn't a book about De Valera coming to America. It's a book about De Valera arriving into America and into the political maelstrom of New York in 1919. So because of that, America in 1919 is an amazing place. We're just post-war. You have, you're 2 years after the Russian Revolution. The Red Scare is on. There were multiple strikes, police, steel, coal strikes. Ku Klux Klan has become a political force. And so you also have this major debate on the League of Nations. And ultimately, the United States Senate will refuse to ratify Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations Covenant. So it introduced me to a whole new era and understanding of that period. When I looked at doing something on Fitzgerald, and I've been looking at doing something on Fitzgerald for a couple of years now, I had, which was really important to have, the geopolitical and the overall economic background of American society at that period. So the trigger being that one core line from This Side of Paradise that Amory Blaine suspected that being Irish was somewhat common. And then onto that, in This Side of Paradise, and it's not too well known in academic literature circles, Fitzgerald writes about De Valera in America. And in fact, in writing this new book, I can show that Fitzgerald saw De Valera, the president of the self-declared Irish Republic, in Boston in 1919. And he writes about that in This Side of Paradise. He also mentions Justice Daniel F. Cohalan, the leader of the Irish American Friends of Irish Freedom in 1919. He also accuses Justice Cohalan and Edward Carson, the leader of the Ulster Unionists, of rancid accusations. And those rancid accusations actually turned Fitzgerald off the Irish question, because at that stage he had developed quite a detailed level of knowledge of what the political situation in Ireland was.
Patrick, I want to spend some time, that whole atmosphere of that era that you're capturing in your book. But before we get there, let's go back to your Irish heritage, your Irish story, where you're from and what brought you from there to here.
Yeah, I'm from Killarney, County Kerry. My father was originally from Kenmare. My mother is from near Killarney. And my father moved to Killarney, and son of a farmer. He trained as a mechanic, set up his own car shop effectively. And we lived on the street. So I'm what in Ireland we'd call a proud townie, though both rural and city would certainly look down on the townie. We lived over a shop, and fortunately I live in Killarney. So at the end of our street, we have a 11,000 acre national park, and we've all the facilities of the number one tourist town in Ireland. I've always had an interest in business because we grew up in a business. I studied business in college. I trained as a chartered accountant. At the time, which was interesting in the 80s, there was very little options in Ireland in terms of progression to third level. And in my innocence, I thought becoming a chartered accountant would be the stepping stone to going into business. But in fact, doing a business degree in Ireland in the 80s was the stepping stone to become a chartered accountant. And so I did that. I trained. I never worked as a chartered accountant. And I spent the next 20, 25 years in business and finance. But my first step actually was after college. I spent a year and a half in New York on a management training program in financial services on a scholarship from my old school.
You're not the first chartered accountant trainee we've talked to who diverged into a literary career. Anything about that background that still serves you well in terms of what you're doing now?
Just more so the understanding of general business knowledge. My first book was on Michael Collins and the foundation of the Irish state. And I was fascinated not by the military history or the intelligence aspect of Michael Collins, but on the nation state building and his role in finance. And so I would hopefully bring some understanding of what it takes to build something. I would have spent quite a lot of my time in early stage companies and in startup companies and even big companies which have problems. The keys to success in business were the same keys that Michael Collins used in setting up the Irish state. And similarly, and probably really interestingly, was De Valera in America. The traditional view was De Valera came to America, failed to get recognition for the Irish Republic, but succeeded in the raising funds for the Irish state, the nascent Irish state. And actually that funding process in America was a management disaster. And pretty much everything, the traditional view or the traditional narrative of De Valera in America, in particular that business side, just doesn't stand up to the contemporary evidence. And certainly when you look at it from the perspective of the Irish Americans, De Valera was an incredibly poor manager. And I even bring in the kind of modern wording to describe the organization of the loan in America as that organization had a toxic culture. And there was just no understanding of processes, control, pointing the right people, delegation of decision-making. So that business background certainly feeds into the first two books and also to the second book, because if we look at F. Scott Fitzgerald and his influences, he is from the Midwest, St. Paul, a pioneering city. And even in 1920, it's, as he describes himself, a third generation town. And it's one thing that I explore a little bit in the book is that F. Scott Fitzgerald doesn't see himself as being someone of a strong character. And he believes he lacks courage and self-respect. And he identifies these as the top character qualities and traits that are required to be a success. And he openly admits he doesn't have them. And if you look at his background, who would have been the men of strong character that he would have looked back on? And one would have been his grandfather, as a successful pioneering businessman. And another would have been James J. Hill, who features in quite a lot of Fitzgerald's writing and nearly in all his novels. And James J. Hill was a pioneer in the railway industry. He earned a sobriquet, the Empire Builder, and one of the most successful and most interesting businessmen I've come across. So I'd probably focus more on a lot of that area than maybe others would.
Before we probe Fitzgerald's Minnesota roots, I'm just going to roll back to De Valera and Collins, because I think it's an interesting perspective that you're looking at them more from an organizational point of view. And the sense that I'm getting, and every Irish person almost to a fault will say, I'm more of a Collins guy, I'm more of a De Valera guy. I'm curious about your thinking on both those. Now we're looking back 100 years and we don't have the tattered flags of the Civil War flying above us anymore. Or maybe we have a little bit of distance to talk about them. So just curious on your general take of these two men who obviously dominated the Irish Revolution.
Yeah, so both
Mhm.
would have complete and contrasting views on the Ireland that they would have effectively fought for. And I do actually, it's an interesting point. At one stage, I listened to the treaty debates in Ireland, those pro treaty and those anti treaty. And one thing that came across listening to those debates is that both sides had respect for each other and both sides understood the reasons why they took their position. They disagreed, but they were very respectful of each other's opinions. And in particular, there's a great quote from it was a female journalist. I can't remember her name, just after Collins died. And she said, Collins loved Ireland not in theory, but in practice. And that sums everything up for me for Collins. So Collins had, I would suggest, no interest in the dead generations. He had no interest in the prophetic future generations. Collins wanted an Ireland that he could live in. He was in his 20s and early 30s, and he was very modern in his outlook. So he wanted control of the banking system. He wanted control of interest rates. He wanted control of fiscal policy. He wanted control of trade policy. And in many ways, he settled on the treaty and supported the treaty because it gave everything he wanted in practice. It didn't give the theory stuff. There's still an oath. There's still the partition had already been a fait accompli. The partition was established a year before the treaty was signed. So he was very practical. Once he got control of fiscal and monetary policy and trade policy, he knew he could build from that. Whereas De Valera's vision would have little concept of the business and creating an environment for young people where they would get housing, health, social support where required. I think Collins' vision would have been open. He wrote quite actively on economics. And at one stage, he says, we need to get the capital in Irish banks used to support business in Ireland. And if we don't, that capital is going to come from overseas. And some of that capital coming from overseas will be good, but some of that capital will not be good capital. So I think the vision, the longer term vision for Ireland for both men is sharply contrasting. And I just think it different. De Valera is an academic. He had a penchant for mathematics, and he had a completely different background to Collins.
Patrick, let's move to the newest book, the latest book. It's Gatsby, Death of an Irishman, very provocative title. The subtitle is F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Search for Identity. Let me come at this from another angle. What should F. Scott Fitzgerald, what does he mean to Ireland? What should he be saying to Ireland? How should the country that he traces his roots to in a problematic way, what is he saying to the home country?
To the home country, unfortunately, not very positive opinion. And it's linked to his opinion of the Irish race in America. Like, for one, Fitzgerald believes the leaders of the Irish Revolution and the Irish people were unfit to govern themselves. But he also held that view of Americans. And in his first book, This Side of Paradise, he regrets that there is no Eton to nurture a ruling class. He believed in an establishment and a ruling class. So he actually was a home rule supporter. So, this is a very critical transitory time in Irish history. And you could want to remain part of Britain. You could want to be home rule, which was a kind of halfway house, and you could be a Republican wanting an Irish Republic. And he was absolutely in favor of home rule through various influences. And linking back to the unfit to govern, similarly, he would have that view about the Justice F. Cohallans of the world. And he refers to politicians in America as muckers and fat paunch bundles of corruption without ideals and without idealism. So he had a negative view on the Irish people's ability to govern themselves. And in 1922, he acquired a copy of Ulysses. And Fitzgerald is a big fan of James Joyce. But on reading Ulysses, he describes as feeling completely naked after reading that, because he sees his own people as being of the same middle class or lower strata of society that's covered in youth. Yeah, he struggled. He certainly struggled with his Irishness.
So at the top of the episode, I referenced the fact that April 10th is the 100th anniversary of the publication of The Great Gatsby. I think it was Scribner and Sons, I believe, who was the original publisher. Talk to us about this year. How much activity do you see around Fitzgerald? Is it primarily American? Was there anything going on in Ireland? I read the book when I was a 16-year-old in secondary school, and it was required reading at that time. I will admit that I was absolutely clueless as to what was going on in that book. I knew little or nothing of the era that Fitzgerald was describing, and yet even looking back now, I am mystified by why that was an assigned reading in Ireland. I think somebody at some point must have said, oh, Fitzgerald, a fine Irish Norman name, he should be on the curriculum. But how much claim does Ireland hold on Fitzgerald, or do you think Irish people think of Fitzgerald, or do they? I thought of him as a child, a 16-year-old child, as purely an American writer. It never even occurred to me to think of Fitzgerald as Irish.
I think that's the case, that, as you say, American as opposed to hyphenated American. And I didn't have him on my curriculum, but there is some. You asked about what activity. There is some. I know the RTE Concert Orchestra is doing a Gatsby themed event, I believe, in the National Concert Hall on the 10th of April. So there are some things happening, but in general, I think there's a very low level of knowledge of that it's actually the centennial of the Great Gatsby. There are a few things coming out of the UK. A few podcasts are obviously coming out and with the usual suspects who are interviewed on the podcasts and very much focused on the same themes, the American dream, whereas I look at the Great Gatsby as not a book about the American dream. It's a book about American identity. And I think that when you look at it from that perspective, the book takes on a whole different characteristic. And maybe that's why Fitzgerald is not understood to be Irish. I think most people's view of the Great Gatsby is still the glitter and the glam, and it's not the underlying themes of destruction and the ultimate misery and dissipated lifestyles. Yeah, I think it's not as celebrated in Ireland as being an Irish or Irish American novel.
Yeah, my take on it is, far from the American dream. Certainly it has a lot of glitter that we associate with the term the Jazz Age, which I think was actually coined by Fitzgerald himself. But actually this kind of underlying carelessness of people, the selfishness, I think, the kind of empty promise of wealth just shines through to me now that I'm reading it as an adult. And of course, the book itself was not successful compared to his first two books, which is shocking because now The Great Gatsby is considered to be, certainly in the English-speaking world, in the top 5 novels of the 20th century. So I want you to reflect a little bit on the failure of the book, at least monetarily, and putting your business cap on that and what that actually meant to Fitzgerald.
Yes. So interestingly, the book was a failure, and it was a really bad time for Fitzgerald to have a failure because he was broke. He was heavily in debt, deeply unhappy, exhausted. But there was 2 print runs, about 24,000 copies, and they didn't sell out. But where Fitzgerald took solace was that the reviews were mixed, with some very negative. But amongst his literary circle, the book was highly praised. So probably the only time Fitzgerald was ever happy in his life was probably in the 3 or 4 months after publication, even though it hadn't become the commercial success. But what happened then is he made a small fortune on the movie rights and theater rights. And that set him up for a few years. And unfortunately, he probably had a little bit too much money in his bank account and didn't resolve personal issues, which I think he, at the very last line he writes in The Great Gatsby, he starts to address the core identity issue that in his own personal life he never did. Yeah, commercially, it turned out to be a very lucrative book, but not because of book sales.
From my business background, it strikes me that he might have had something of a branding problem. I read a comment, I think maybe it was in your book. He was disappointed by the reviews. He was disappointed by the positive reviews because he felt no one was getting in the review space. No one was getting what he was actually doing in the book. At the same time, he was making his living in magazine writing, more popular type of writing, mass market writing. And now he's written an art book and he's surprised that his audience hasn't come along with him. Is there something to that?
No, for sure. And he hated writing short stories because he had to do them to bail himself out of debt. And he describes it as writing trash. And so when he started The Great Gatsby, he wanted to escape his reputation as the philosopher of the flapper. And he wanted to create a work of art. And he described it as he wanted to create something new, extraordinary, simple, beautiful, and intricately patterned. And he wanted to create this book that was inspired by wonder and illusion. But when he moved to the south of France, and you can picture Zelda and Scott, and they're in Hier, in between Marseille and Nice, and it's a hillside, and they're sitting on the terrace of the Café L'Univers. And as Fitzgerald writes, there's an au fait Mediterranean moon, and life is perfect. He's going to write this great a novel better than any American has ever written. And unfortunately, that's perfect. So he's this vision of this work of art. But unfortunately, Zelda has an affair. Not quite sure whether it's a consummated affair or not, but the affair happened. And all of a sudden, Fitzgerald starts beginning to lose his illusion and his wonder in life. And he's also running out of cash. The book is delayed. He has to rewrite practically half of the book because this theme of illusion and wonder is gone. And he starts telling his friends that he feels old and he yearns for when he was 22 and first in New York, and his first short story was accepted for publication. And he's got all this enthusiasm for the future. And all of a sudden, then we see the repeat the past theme come into Gatsby. He would like to repeat the past, but he knows that can't happen. We also have in Gatsby an affair, and that wonderful line, which there's no doubt it's Fitzgerald wrote the line after Zelda had the affair with the French aviator, that there are things between Daisy and me that you will never know. So, that long-term relationship of a husband and wife, despite the ups and downs, there is that relationship. And that line clearly comes direct from his experience in the south of France.
No, I was just going to say, the atmosphere, the time you describe throughout your book that leads up to Gatsby, tracing F. Scott Fitzgerald's kind of history, his intellectual history through his life. It's just, I realized how young America was at that point, that things were happening for the first time, that the massive wealth out on the North Shore of Long Island was unprecedented, even looks unprecedented almost by most of today's standards, that how close we actually were to the Civil War, and some of the kind of racist feel to little sections of Gatsby that you bring out, his sort of sympathies for the romanticized vision of the Confederacy, and how close we actually were to the Irish migration coming in after the Great Hunger, and all that stuff about East and West, the America, this sort of, he's from the East, he's from the West. And at that time, the West meant Minnesota, and the train travel. I was thinking of the Music Man going from place to place on trains. It just spoke to such a different America, such a young America, really.
Yeah, I went to St. Paul for the first time, the birthplace of Fitzgerald, I think in last September. And I'd also been to Princeton, where he went to college, and I went out to Long Island. And probably the most exciting or best perspective given to me was in St. Paul. I saw the Mississippi for the first time. Now, Mississippi is growing up in Ireland, Huckleberry Finn is on the curriculum. We all learn how to spell Mississippi. It's what the first word you learn. It defines, I have a strong interest in the Civil War, the American Civil War. So that plays a huge role in terms of control of the Mississippi being a key factor in the victory of the Northern forces. I saw a bridge and I said, I'd walk across the bridge. And halfway across, there's a plaque on the bridge and it says, this is the site of the first bridge across the Mississippi. It's just hard to believe. And it really brought home the immigrants who made their way to St. Paul in the 1830s and 40s. We're at a frontier town. And if you're going there with ambition and you're going looking for opportunity. And that was a real eye opener for me in terms of the Fitzgerald, the McQuillan family, his maternal family, and as I describe in the book, beyond St. Paul is untamed territory. And with that, we raise issues about race. You also have the issues with Native American displacement, and Fitzgerald shows no sympathy or understanding for that side of history.
Just in thinking about this interesting transition and what you've chosen to write about. You wrote 2 books about the Irish Revolution. Now you've gone and written about one of the kind of titanic figures of American literature. Lots and lots of books have been written about Fitzgerald. So why would people choose to read your specific book? What do you think you were mining that wasn't as readily covered in all these other biographies of Fitzgerald that are out there?
Looking at my first book was on Michael Collins, and I'd unearthed a whole side of him that wasn't in the narrative of Michael Collins. With De Valera, it was the narrative of looking at De Valera from the perspective of the Irish Americans. And that opened up a whole new perspective on De Valera. And with F. Scott Fitzgerald, it became clear to me most literature and most work on Fitzgerald is done by literary academics who approach the subject from a literary academic point of view. Most also are American. I'm guessing most are non-Irish American. There'll be a certain amount, whatever the percentage of Irish American is, that's the number of Irish American academics. So people were looking at it from a literature point of view, not necessarily an identity point of view. And Fitzgerald's first book, This Side of Paradise, is a very uncovered piece of literature. And I think when somebody, I don't know, a literature academic comes across This Side of Paradise and sees references to Edward Carson and Justice Daniel F. Cohalan and De Valera, I think they may just back away because these are different. It takes a lot of work to have the historical understanding and the literature understanding. So I think I had an advantage in my first book, The Revolution at the Waldorf. I put a huge amount of work into This Side of Paradise because I had to. And that gave the leverage of understanding Fitzgerald and ultimately The Great Gatsby being a story of identity. And I think that's, as far as I can see, quite a unique perspective, looking at from not just literature, but from historical and from a very Irish identity perspective.
When I think of Fitzgerald, if we strip away his novels, the next word that comes to mind is alcoholism.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody becomes an alcoholic out of a place of happiness. If you probe his biographical background, what would you point to as the sources of his alcoholism and what becomes really a profligate and turbulent life?
I think we slightly mentioned one earlier. He believed he lacked character. That's something, that's a weakness that would, certainly in the Midwest of the time. And also he specifically says he believes he lacked courage and self-respect. Interestingly, that's what he admires in Zelda, her courage, and he says flaming self-respect. And if you look at the characters in his books, the female characters, he frequently mentions their courage and self-respect. So he doesn't have it himself, so he's seeking that elsewhere. Then linking that, why would you lack self-respect? And Fitzgerald, as a child, his mother is Molly McQuillan. His father is Edward Fitzgerald. And as he says himself, like, there's a really interesting, John, you mentioned it, we're very close to Civil War. So 25 years after Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant, Fitzgerald's parents get married. And Molly McQuillan is Minnesota, Northern. Edward Fitzgerald is Southern from Maryland. And Fitzgerald describes it as both families imposing their own ancestral pretensions on the other, and that he's caught in the middle. Although the McQuillans had money because of Philip F. McQuillan, who immigrated, I think it was in the 1840s, became a very successful businessman in St. Paul in the grocery trade, which is important because Fitzgerald frequently mentions grocery, even in The Great Gatsby, when J. Gatsby is exposed in the Great Confrontation Plaza scene. Tommy Cannon says that he can't imagine how Gatsby would have known Daisy 5 years earlier unless he brought groceries to the back door. So he carries a deep shame of his Irishness. And what he tries to do then in terms of identity, his father was Edward Fitzgerald, but he doesn't see himself as Irish on his father's side. He believes he's Irish on his mother's side only, and regularly claims this, I'm Irish on one side only. Now, his Princeton friends don't see that. They see him Irish as two sides, both sides. And what he latched onto was his Fitzgerald grandfather married Cecilia Ashton Scott. And Cecilia Ashton Scott was of old Maryland's first family, 17th century family. And he perceives that as being American. So he latches onto that. And he specifically mentions frequently the author of The Star-Spangled Banner. He specifically mentions Francis Scott Key as being his relative, but he refers to him as a close relative, whereas in fact he's a second cousin 3 times removed. So this is Fitzgerald's way of being American, and that's, we started the questioning on the insecurities and the inferiority complex and what drives alcoholism in person, the lack of character. And so he latches on to what he believes is American. And this is the question of the novel, The Great Gatsby, and of Fitzgerald's life. Who is American? And it's a question equally valid today. Who is American? And in Fitzgerald's eyes, being American is, at the time, was of being colonial Anglo-Saxon stock. And to me, the difference between F. Scott Fitzgerald and people like Justice Daniel F. Cohalan never believed his Americanism was any way inferior to anybody else's. He was American. He didn't have to justify or try to be a different type of American. So once he was solid in his own Americanism, he could embrace his Irish heritage. Fitzgerald did not, inside himself, believe himself to be American, except for the Ashton Scott Key blood making him American. And that's why I would suggest he would have rejected his Irishness. And by rejecting who you are, not making any diagnosis of the disease, alcoholism, I think that certainly would be a factor in the psychology of Fitzgerald.
He also had the Irish Catholic element to probably, in his mind, overcome. And he had a very curious relationship with Catholicism back and forth, to the point where briefly you describe he briefly considered being a priest.
Yeah, and Fitzgerald's a massive contradictions. Religion played a big part in his life, and in Newman School, the Catholic preparatory school, he came under the influence of Father Fay. And Father Fay was an Episcopalian convert. And what attracted Fitzgerald to him was that he was also of a wealthy Philadelphia family background. So Fitzgerald is attracted to status and wealth, and Father Fay introduced him to Catholic Eastern elitism. So Catholicism wasn't something that was second-class position in the Midwest, in particular Minnesota. He was introduced to a new form of Catholicism. And similarly, Father Fay introduced him to Shane Leslie, an Anglo-Irish politician, author, poet, who Fitzgerald described as the most romantic figure he'd ever met. And Leslie was in his mid-20s, tall, elegant man, aristocracy background in Ireland, and a big home rule supporter. And he wrote a book called Celt and the World. And this plays into the Fitzgerald's attitude. You can see in here just a race attitude here. Leslie's book looked at the place of the Celt in the world, and he described the Celt and the Teuton both being equal of the Aryan race. And he describes the Celt as being the underdog in the fight against the materialistic Teuton. So Fitzgerald grasps onto this. This is like equal. And also the Celts being the underdog, like he had a soft spot for the Confederacy as being the underdog, the lost cause. So this appealed to him. And to be fair, Fitzgerald immersed himself in the Irish literary revival whilst he's in Princeton. And so he goes from shame, and all of a sudden instead of shame, he's something to be proud of, being Celtic and Irish. And he refers to his Celtic pillars, and he immerses himself in Yeats, Synge, Gregory, in quite detail. He knows their works very well. He also writes a review of Leslie's book in the Nassau Review in Princeton. And he specifically mentions Patrick Pearse and Joseph Mary Plunkett and the Irish. He calls the 1916 rebellion romantic and mystical, but unfortunate because he was a Home Rule supporter. But Patrick Pearse and Joseph Mary Plunkett weren't mentioned by Leslie in Leslie's book. So it's obviously Fitzgerald knows these names well, which one would expect for anybody with an interest in the Irish question at the time. So he has immersed himself in that Irish question. And at the same time, under the influence of Leslie and Faye, he embraces his Irishness. He signs off letters, Gaelic yours, and God bless you Celtically. In the review of the book, he declares himself an Irishman. And so it's almost that he's eventually found a crutch to give him some pride in who he was himself. And he even sends a photograph. He just got a passport, and he sent a spare photograph to his friend, Edmund Wilson. And Edmund Wilson would become a well-known literary critic and certainly was a frenemy of Fitzgerald. And Edmund Wilson had gone to the right preparatory schools and was an elite figure at Princeton. And Fitzgerald sends Edmund Wilson his photograph, and he says, I know I look like a Teuton, but I can prove myself a Celt. So this is a huge statement. And also the fact that he called the 1916 Rising mystical and romantic, that was quite a revolutionary act in Princeton of the time, where the Irish Rebellion would have been seen as a pro-German act. Although America hadn't entered the war, Britain had entered the war. So it was quite a revolutionary statement.
So I think what your book reveals is ultimately Fitzgerald rejects, he plunges into this immersion, if you will, in terms of understanding Irish politics, in terms of understanding Irish literature, but ultimately he rejects his Irishness. Father Faye dies in 1919, I think, as a result of the pandemic flu, a relatively young man in his 40s. And the title of your book, Gatsby, Death of an Irishman, kind of signifies, at least how I took it, was essentially with the publication of that book, he was done with Irish themes. There is no trace of anything Irish in Gatsby, unlike his earlier books. Is that why you chose that particular title?
Yes, and so during this side of Paradise, his first book, he writes that Imre Blaine actually says in a piece of dialogue, I have no people. And that was Fitzgerald's statement, that he has no people. The break was done. The break with the Irish question, the break with his Celtic pillars of his philosophy, all gone. Porter Faye has died. He's met Zelda Sayre, who was the beginning and end of everything for him, and she's his only God. So Irishness is done. And then over the next couple of years before he starts writing The Great Gatsby, what he writes about Ireland is not good. He's quite derogatory in The Beautiful and Damned. And then he starts The Great Gatsby, and there is almost no trace of Ireland in there. He mentions in a long list of names of people who attend Gatsby's parties, he mentions some random Irish names. I can't remember, there's probably over 40 family names. So there is no Irishness. And that in itself is the key. Why is there no Irishness from a guy whose 3 grandparents are Irish and who's grew up in an extremely Irish environment and who was patriotic in terms of the literature of Ireland and in terms of the Irish Revolution? And on the very last possible moment, and the very last day he could make a change to The Great Gatsby, the novel, After he'd spent months writing it, rewriting it, he'd sent the final draft to Scribner's in New York. At this stage, he's in Rome, deeply unhappy, drinking too much, exhausted, tired, running out of money. Zelda's relationship, they're not in good shape. He sent the manuscript to Scribner, to Max Perkins, but she can't figure out the main scene, the confrontation, the scene between Tom Buchanan and Jay Gatsby. And it's really eating him up. And he spends the next 6 weeks trying to get this scene right. And he can't. He just can't get it. And on the very final day, he sends a wire to Max Perkins in New York. Hold up Galley 40 for big change. So it's the very last moment. It's at the printers. The galleys have been set. This is it. This is his final opportunity. And he sends a letter with the edits. And he's changed radically the Plaza Hotel confrontation. And the last line, as much as we could determine, but the last line that he writes is, Gatsby looked like he killed a man. And that line was critical. And I've seen no academic approach that line, address that line, because he writes that Gatsby looked like he killed a man, but he puts the killed a man in its own quotation marks. And he makes it very clear that he does not mean Gatsby took anyone's life. If you look at the text, it becomes very clear. So what's after happening is Gatsby has self-invented into this idealized version of himself. Jay Gatsby is Jimmy Gats from the Midwest. Fitzgerald is Fitzgerald from the Midwest. So this Jimmy Gats invents himself into the idealized version of himself, which is this crazy caricature of Gatsby, swollen yellow Rolls Royce, pink shirts, Hotel de Ville mansion, a ridiculous speech affectation of old sport, which anybody with any breeding sees through. So it's a really ridiculous caricature that Jimmy Gats invents himself into. And why does he self-invent? Because he wants to assimilate. He wants to be seen as American. He's a German. It sure kind of gives him a German immigrant background, but if you look back into the history of the text and Absolution, the story which the text was originally based on, very clear it's an Irish immigrant background. And so this Jimmy Gats self-invents into the idealized version of himself to assimilate into American society. And it's not just about wealth. He wants acceptance. So when Jay Gatsby is exposed in the confrontation with Buchanan, and Buchanan calls him a Mr. Nobody from nowhere, fit enough only to bring the groceries to the back door, a common criminal, Gatsby's mask shatters. And that look, and Fitzgerald says, for a moment, that look that he killed a man is on his face for just a single moment. And what's after happening, Gatsby realizes he's killed his younger self. He's self-invented so far that he actually can't repeat the past. He can't go back to being who he was. And that was who was killed. And when you picture Fitzgerald on the very last day, the last morning, the very last opportunity to make a change, that's the change he makes. And in fact, I would suggest that it's Fitzgerald, consciously or otherwise, realizing that his own self-invention was killing his younger self, who he was, his Irishness, his Catholicism, his Midwest, and taking that a step further was the death of an Irishman.
Patrick, you lead us to a great way to conclude. Great final words on the book right there. Let's just move into the shameless plug portion where we get to find out, where do we get the book? How do we find out more about you? Are you going to come and talk about the book here? What's next for you with this book and how can we earn it?
I'm launching the book on the 11th of April in the wonderful Celtic Junction Art Centre. And they have a fabulous night planned, not just a launch, but they have their own Gatsby-themed event going on. I'm also launching it in Dublin the following Tuesday at the Royal Irish Academy. It's on the 15th of April. And I hope to do some more presentations in the States. I actually did a kind of preview presentation at the American Irish Historical Center last September, October, which was special for me because as I mentioned, I came to New York. I was 20 years of age on a scholarship from school. And I was living in Queens as one would, and I was sharing a house, even though I was commuting by the number 7 into Wall Street to do a training program and I'm wearing a suit. I'm living with carpenters and I'm on the train with the chippies and it's just the standard bunch of lads hanging out. And on Sunday afternoons, I used to take the train and I'd get a hot dog and a Coke and sit on the steps of the Met and looking at these amazing apartments. And I remember seeing the American Irish Historical Society and thinking, that's not a place where I would be. And then 30 years later, I get to make a presentation on Fitzgerald and Princess Great and Justice Daniel F. Cohalan. And I'd to thank Elizabeth Stack and everybody there and everybody who turned up. And actually, that's where I met Martin for the first time.
Yeah, and I think, as our listeners know, the American Irish Historical Society is much in the news. We're hopeful that things will settle down there. Specifically, we can have talented historians like yourself, Patrick, come and talk about people like Fitzgerald at a level of depth that maybe most of us don't really realize. I think we all carry thumbnail histories around in our heads about people, and then it's fascinating how that exploded. And the American Irish Historical Society, specifically under Elizabeth Stack's leadership, has done an extraordinary job of communicating the actual complexities of history, be it an individual, be it a movement, be it a place. And certainly John and me are doing our best to make sure that continues to be the case. And we're looking forward to certainly welcoming you back at the Historical Society for your next endeavor, whatever that may be. So with that, I'd like to say on behalf of John and myself and our listeners, thank you so much for coming on Irish Stew. It was a fascinating opportunity to probe the extraordinary, turbulent psyche that was one of America's greatest novelists, who led a tragic life and sadly died at the age of 44 in Los Angeles. And I think once you understand this aspect of his personality, his self-rejection of his own identity, a lot of other things fall in place. And indeed, if you don't understand that, maybe you don't really understand his novels, nor can you understand The Great Gatsby, which mystified me as a 16-year-old. And certainly your book has lent a whole different level of understanding of Fitzgerald and that novel. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mark.
Well, John, history and literature all combined together kept my nerd instinct really happy. And I think one of the big understandings from this book, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, as a 16-year-old reading this book in Ireland, I hadn't a clue what is going on. But now when I turn my adult eye onto it, I have an understanding of just how difficult it was to be an Irish American Catholic in the 1920s. And we forget sometimes that it really isn't until the election of JFK where Irish American Catholics put that, I don't want to use handicap, but let's say their status is fully incorporated into the country at that point. And so without understanding that, you can't really understand Fitzgerald, and you can't, as Patrick told us, understand The Great Gatsby. Fabulous book. And I'm delighted that you're going to give us a little flavor from the end of the great novel.
Sure. Let's end this episode with the same words F. Scott Fitzgerald used to end The Great Gatsby. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.
Beat on. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.